we're going to move to some questions now. So please speak into the microphone and please give your name and institutional affiliation if you have one. And I'll take 1 or 2 rounds of questions depending on the time and how many there are. And I do have some online questions. So whilst the microphone, you're thinking, and the microphone is being circulated, I'll put a couple of those. Sue Coe, who works for World Vision, today is the Global International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So a very poignant day to launch this important work. And is asking the panel to comment on whether the research discovered what they discovered amongst the subset of children with impairments who are prone to high levels of discrimination and exclusion, and especially girls. A second question from Laura Boone of IRC about the internal and cross-border migration of children, wondering if the research considered how societal violence, disaster and displacement affect patterns of poverty and people's ability to recover and cope. Okay, so now we'll also move, I'll ask some more questions from online questions shortly, move to the audience.
Hi, my name is Zain from a Research Associate in Child Protection at the University of Edinburgh. I was just interested in the animation because it wasn't covered in your presentation, Kia, that some of the girls that get married very young, at 13, end up with the babies, and you didn't mention what happens to those children. Is it a case similar to the Philippines, or what's happening there? Because for me, that's another child protection problem.
Hi, my name is Pete Kent. I'm East Africa Regional Director for Railway Children. We work with children that live on the streets in different parts of the world. It's a question really around how does the panel consider, if we sort of turn the question on its head a little bit and ask how does violence drive poverty? Because we find that with a lot of the interventions that we try and develop, which are partly informed from fields of neuroscience and child development, that in actual fact, if we invest in economic strengthening, less would we deal with the emotional traumatic effects of violence, then the children or the parents in families, they just can't, they haven't got the cognitive emotional capacity to actually take advantage of those interventions. So unless it comes alongside of therapeutic support for those adults, often of carers of children, then we find that they can't take advantage from that. So.
Hi, this is Katie Rulin from the Institute of Development Studies. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I just wanted to pick up on the first one about economic strengthening and the links to child protection or child violence. Firstly, a positive note in terms of the social protection programs that Laura mentioned. We've been doing some research in Rwanda and Ghana and find that cash transfer programs can indeed have positive effects on child protection, in particular care of children and preventing separation of families and supporting family reunification. But with that, I would also like to challenge your, as Richard called it, sort of linear thinking around economic strengthening programs, poverty reduction, and therefore reduction in child violence or child protection violations, by looking at these programs in a bit more detail and their specific components, and to what extent they all have positive effects or can actually undermine some of these positive effects or create perverse incentives. So in that same research on social protection, for example, we saw that public works components can not necessarily directly increase child labor, but certainly have implications for child care. Similarly, with conditional cash transfers, the added pressures on caregivers can have implications for child care. And if we talk about economic strengthening programs more along the lines of livelihoods programs that support asset accumulation, what happens to the accumulated assets? If there's more livestock, if there's more land, children are often engaged in working those assets. So I was wondering if you've done a bit more nuancing of that sort of economic strengthening programs category. Thanks.
Okay, we'll take one more and then come to the panel.
Hello. Thanks again for your interesting presentations. I had a question, I guess. Perhaps this has to do with sort of knowing more about what we don't know. I've done a lot of child protection frontline work in very poor countries, where we're often seeing children leaving, being displaced from very poor circumstances into very poor circumstances. But most recently was working with the Syrian refugee response. And this was, for me, the first time seeing children leaving more stable, less environmentally poor circumstances and moving into very vulnerable circumstances. And I was wondering if that was sort of one of those questions that we, something that we don't really know yet, the impact around the protection, the different protection concerns or challenges that we might have in that kind of a scenario. I also just wanted to make a comment, and this was about your some of what you touched on, Richard, about monitoring and evaluation. And I'm just going to be saying something that you already know. I've worked primarily in complex emergencies, and I've said it for a long time that in programming we really are not paying enough attention to our monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. We do continue to look at it as something that we need to tick the box for the donor. Most recently, I'm quite interested in evaluation and learning, as well as accountability, and I was really pushing for it in our new project design. Institutionally, from the donor side, as well as from my management side, I didn't get the response at all to involve child participation, but also just to build monitoring and evaluation in from the beginning and all the way through. I'm just telling you stuff you already know. But we are not, particularly my experience in complex emergencies, we're not at all picking up. So even from the donor perspective, we're still very focused on quantitative and not qualitative. We're not at all taking advantage of the opportunity to learn. And so we're still doing the same type of programming over a number of years in complex emergencies at any rate, in my experience.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to the panel now. Don't feel you have to answer every question. I suggest you pick those that you feel you can respond to. Rachel.
I will just respond on two. The first question then about children with impairments. As Laura mentioned, very few of the studies we looked at did any disaggregation in terms of the children who were benefiting or not benefiting from those programs, and none disaggregated by any kind of impairment at all. We did find in our review of the relationship between poverty and child protection violations that children with impairments, as you mentioned, are at greater risk of both physical and sexual violence, but the studies didn't look at how poverty further exacerbated or affected that risk. And then I also wanted to comment on a couple of people who raised the question of child labour in one way or another. This study was framed to look at 4 areas of child protection violations. Physical and sexual abuse, inadequate care and early marriage. It wasn't intended to cover every possible kind of child protection violation. Linking into what people have said about the poor quality of some of the evidence, the studies we looked at on the whole didn't comment on kind of the wider implications. So, like Keita was mentioning, the issues of, for example, economic strengthening programs creating extra work for children. It is a well-known risk in the literature, as Richard also mentioned, and there is certainly evidence that it can happen. One of the studies we looked at, interestingly, some of the girls didn't want to participate in the microfinance and small business elements because they were concerned that it would damage their education. But that was really the one hint in all the 83 studies we looked at of this being a concern. And I think it is partly because they were very focused on their specific issue. They were monitoring the effects on early marriage or the effects on physical violence, and partly because they didn't didn't have means to draw on more qualitative insights and to explore more with the children concerned, you know, the wider aspects of their lives that may or may not have been affected by these programs. So, I mean, I think it really ties in with what has been said a lot about really very poor monitoring and evaluation, and not thinking very holistically about these violations and the fact that children could be experiencing many at once that are all affected by poverty to some degree or other.
I'll just pick up on the question about sort of psycho-emotional or therapeutic support. This was a striking cross-country finding, and I think it wasn't just on the part of adults, you know, having a demand or a need for that type of support, but again and again we heard that both prior to migration, but also during the migration process, and at the end of, you know, once children had returned, that was, you know, one of the things that they thirsted most for was someone in whom they could confide, an adult who could make decisions that would change things. There was no sense of access to counseling, even in a, you know, in our middle income country like Vietnam. That was a huge deficit. And in the case of Ethiopia, where many of the girls are returning with severe trauma from multiple and repeated physical and sexual exploitation, there are no services at all, and the government is very upfront about not having any services in place. So I think in addition to economic and vocational support for attorneys, then that's an area we need to think and invest very quickly if we're going to avoid some of these broader societal costs that Richard was talking about.
Okay, talking about the babies of migrants, for the newlyweds, most of the time when they migrate to these countries, couples migrate together. So for the newlyweds who migrate to the Gulf state, the babies can be born in those countries. So most of the time they raise them there. But what we have encountered in Hara was that we can find grandparents and children living in, I mean, mothers are missing. And I was rushing through the slides, and you can see that most of the migrants have relatives within the destination countries, and most of them are mothers. So most of the children are left here with their grandparents.
Okay, Laura, do you have any comments?
Yes, I was just, if that's okay, I was just going to pick up on a couple of things. One of them was the question from Keating, the gentleman from Railway Child, about, you know, is the economic strengthening component enough? Do we know enough about the effects of the different components, which might not necessarily be positive, there might be perverse incentives? And I would suggest from Rachel's review that we don't, and that's a real problem, because the effectiveness of the different components isn't disaggregated, and there isn't much exploration of the mechanisms. So in relation to that, I'd recommend a really good paper in evaluation by Westthorpe, which looked at parental education in Australia, and she took a realist evaluation method to look at the kind of mechanisms that explained why it was least successful for the poorest people within that sample. I think it's a very good example. My second comment was just a vignette in response to your comment about evaluation in complex emergencies. I met someone from the DFID office in West Africa the other week, and they were talking about the problems that they'd had trying to get good M&E data, good M&E systems set up to monitor the Ebola epidemic. And people would sort of say, you know, you want to collect M&E data at a time like this as they're all sort of running around hysterically. And her argument was that, of course, if you don't collect that data, how will you know how to respond to complex emergencies like this in the future? So I think that's a very important point.
Oh, well, Laura took my point almost word for word, but that's fine to reinforce it. I can't resist responding because this question is catnip to me, you know, monitoring, evaluation and learning. So is it save the children? Is it understand the lives of children, what affects the lives of children? Or is it understand the lives of children in order to save the children? I mean, that's the sort of the complex thing. Yes, it's systematically and massively underinvested in and has been for 50-odd years. What does it take to change that? It's not only front-loading programs with M&E budgets and goals. It's secondly being clear about the goals of a program. Is it test and learn, or is it empower and change social norms, or is it indeed reduce deprivations and save lives? And thirdly, even with the strongest goals for learning, those goals often get changed by program managers' decisions on the ground. And I think that shouldn't be underestimated either. In other words, programs that start off with a primary goal of learning often include a secondary goal of improving children's lives, and then that becomes a primary goal in the implementation process, and the learning gets systematically reduced.
Thank you. I'm going to allow us to run 5 minutes over and just take a few more questions. A couple of online questions that are both the same, actually, from Laura Boone, again from the IRC, and from David Walker, who actually worked on this research program in Uganda, about investing in parents as well as investing in children. The question is really whether in child protection we focus enough on parenting, and whether in the case of a lot of the work focusing on child rights rather than on the parental responsibilities, and do the panel feel that's we should change our focus? Are there other questions?
Thanks. It's actually more of a comment than a question. It's mainly directed at Laura, really, which I thought, you know, the kind of analysis you gave of the material that ODI has been looking at and so on was quite accurate, but I wonder whether it really reflects where we are today. I think it reflects where the literature is, but I wonder whether it's, I think as a sector, we're moving on quite fast in this area, and there are several things happening around the recent Lancet series on child maltreatment and so on, and violence against women and girls. A lot of the NGOs, including Save the Children and I know World Vision and so on, are building relationships now with academic institutions precisely in order to collect robust evidence. And a lot of that is going on at the moment. And we, for example, have links with McGill University, Columbia University, and the London School and so on. So the way we've done it is, in a sense, to try and build those links with institutions that can help us do the kind of research, because I don't believe, frankly, that trying to do it through M&E is going to be the solution at all if we really want the kind of evidence that I think is valuable. And the other comment I just make is that, of course, the other source of evidence is the academic community. And I think there is a good question, or a challenge to you in a sense, about why the academic community is not providing the evidence base we need. That it's in child protection, it is so focused in the developed world. We have incredibly complex and sophisticated pieces of work going on, but very little in the developing world. And why is this gap there? And what do you think the academic community can do to redress that? Because that's I think we do rely on you in many ways to provide information. Although, again, we have a major problem as an NGO, for example, about accessing academic evidence, because it's not available in journals that we have access to at all very easily, and at quite high expense. So really, I think some challenges back to the academic community that maybe have more responsibility for some of this than actually the NGO community, which has tried to do its best, but have got, it's basically not there to do this kind of work. It's there to provide protection to children on the ground. That's what we're there for. And just to pick up on one of Nicola's points about, you mentioned this kind of has the pendulum swung the wrong way in respect of sort of, child migration and children on the move, and you say, is it emphasising too much the positives these days? Well, that was a deliberate move, wasn't it? Because in fact, I think there was a concern that the focus was so much on the negative aspects of child movement that in fact it was getting in the way of supporting safe migration by children, which in today's world is becoming increasingly common. And the example of Ethiopia and Vietnam are both examples of just today we have very large numbers of children moving between countries and within countries, and what we have to do is create safe opportunities for that movement. And the previous kind of paradigm around child movement was so negative about, in your argument about kind of what we need is protection, not policing. It was policing, and in many ways it still is. So maybe we've gone too far, but that was what lay behind that move to try and facilitate safe movement rather than just kind of trying to stop all movement, which we know we can't do, and which drives it underground and criminalises it. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil, for those useful questions. I'll take one more, if there is one, and then we'll have the panel wrap up.
Thank you. Andrew Shepherd from ODI, the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. Great research bringing together these two very separated discourses. I'd just like to pick up on one issue. You have some quite dramatic findings about the role that neglect plays. So in some middle-income countries, Botswana, Mexico, Vietnam, between 30 and 48% of children have been left without competent care at some point. And then, I mean, from what I can see, there aren't many studies included in the review of attempts to deal with neglect. I mean, it's a bit the same as the last question in a way. Is that because those studies simply aren't there? There simply isn't the evidence? Is this a greatly neglected issue? I mean, in the West, this is a very, very actively researched issue, looking at the mental health consequences and the consequences for the criminal justice system and so on and so forth. Does it simply not, are those connections not there in developing countries?
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to the panel to make their last comments as succinctly as possible in response to those questions, and there will be an opportunity for discussion afterwards.
Just to respond to your question, Bill, about has the pendulum swung too far, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, I think what we uncovered in Ethiopia is egregious abuse on a really large scale that deserves urgent attention. So maybe we need to go back to having a simultaneous track of looking at the strengths and the weaknesses. But I think similarly in Vietnam, where there's been so much focus on the rising Asian tiger, the powerhouse of Southeast Asia. Again, very widespread numbers of children living in terrible conditions. So I think we do need to be continuing to balance that, and that's what we've tried to do here. I mean, I'm not sure, Andrew, if it sort of addresses your question about the extent to which there are studies or not looking at responses to neglect. But there was another event here yesterday at ODI that was focusing on justice sector reform, but for policing to try and address violence against women and children. And what really struck me, and maybe there's someone here, I'm not sure, but there was no crossover in the typical audiences that would come to a child protection meeting or a child poverty meeting. I didn't recognize a single face. And the discourse was completely separate from anything we've been discussing today. People were only focusing on policing and sort of securitization. There was, I think people were quite shocked when I was sort of suggesting that maybe we could look at intervening through economic strengthening or through health sector interventions or through schooling. It just wasn't on that, wasn't part of that discourse at all. So I think, while we're trying to reach out to build connections with people in the poverty communities and child protection, we've also got to go another step and bring in people from security programming and justice sector reforms, because donors like DFID are putting in huge resources there, but there's really no crossover, and I think many missed opportunities for synergized programming.
Thank you. Do you have any final comments? I know Kia has... No?
I was just going to respond to Bill's comment. It's very cherished now. Firstly, I think, yes, if we did it again now, it would be very different. I mean, the review was done in 2012, 2013, and in part due to the kind of momentum generated by initiatives like these, there has been a lot more work since then, and that obviously isn't captured. I thought your question about why aren't academics working on this was an interesting one, and I think it's a problem of labelling, the same problem that you were alluding to, in that if I think of my colleagues, some of them are working on the effects of migration on left behind children, some of them are working on skills training and microcredit for young people, but they would never say they were working on child protection. They just don't construct it in that way. I think your third point also about, I'm not obviously representing the academic community, although I am the token academic, well, one of the token academics, but I think that point about firewalls is a good one, but it's one that is now being addressed by funding councils and by DFID. So anyone who receives the grant now has to ensure at least green open access, which means that you can, through, say, an institutional repository, you can access the findings. So I hope it will be a lot easier in the future for us to share knowledge in that way. And I certainly agree that my colleagues could make more efforts to engage with NGOs and engage with NGO projects, because that's an incredibly rewarding practice, and you really feel like you know what's happening at the cutting edge.
Richard?
Thanks, and maybe just the question online about children and then parents, and where's the balance? I mean, firstly to point out some of the most vulnerable parents are children, or children who are likely to become parents. So I mean, that's, I think, an important group, child mothers. And yeah, I mean, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I think, is fairly clear about the obligations of governments to support parents who face material deprivation and economic constraints about protecting their children's rights. So the Convention at least covers both.
Thank you very much. Just to sum up also with a reference to Bill's question about what academics are doing, we have just undertaken a review for the SRC on their funded research over the last 3-4 years and the extent to which children's issues are covered within that research. And it's been really difficult because, of course, there is a lot of material in all these research reports about children, but it's not strategically laid out and designed. So what we're learning isn't linked up, and I think for me one of the biggest lessons and outcomes of this particular session, which we've known for a long while, is this chronic lack of linkage and chronic lack of strategy around addressing these problems. And the feeling, which is why we started this project, that if people working on poverty or people working in the justice sector saw children, we could achieve so much more. And so I'll leave you with that. And I know all of you work, many of you work on child-focused issues, but keep on trying to get others involved, because I do think that's one of the ways we can address many of these problems. So thank you to the panel, and to Rachel, unfortunately had to leave early, but thank you to everyone involved in this programme of work, to our discussants for a very rich discussion. Please join us now for some refreshments outside. Thank you very much.